G'day, I'm Owen, you've joined the pub test. And in this one we are continuing the Jack the Ripper suspect series. And in this one we are looking at Jacob Isenschmid. Who was he and how does he fit into the Jack the Ripper saga? Well, let's put it to the pub test. Now, Jacob had a couple of nicknames. One, the Mad Butcher. The second, the Mad Pork Butcher. So I'm suggesting that maybe he wasn't Jewish and probably of the Gentile butcher type. But the one consistent thing in his description was that he was mad. Now, we don't know a great deal about him yet. We do know that he was Swiss. Now, therefore, this theory has lots of holes in it. Now, I just paused there so you could stop your laughing. If you need to laugh a little bit longer, just hit the pause button, but I will keep moving. Now, I said he was around 40 years old, but why did this bloke come onto the radar at all? Well, he was actually arrested not long after the Annie Chapman crime, so the second official victim of Jack the Ripper. At the time, the perpetrator was generally known as the Whitechapel Killer, and they were searching for Leather Apron. Now, both those things are interesting as we go through Jacob Isenschmid's story. But the fact that he was quickly apprehended, I believe, shows that this was the attitude of the general public at the time. They were suggesting this criminal who's doing these horrendous things, one, could not be English, because an English person wouldn't do these crimes. So it had to be an immigrant of some sort. So Isenschmid ticks that box. Also, it couldn't be someone of a sound mind. They would have to be insane. And the fact this bloke was known as the Mad Butcher, well, that also ticked the box. Then it was also suggested that the person doing these crimes had some anatomical knowledge. Well, being a butcher, again, yes, we could say he fits that description. So it didn't take much for him to be placed under arrest. Yet, in all fairness, we know that many of the butchers were immigrants. And a few of them, as we've even discussed in this series, weren't exactly known to be quite right in the head either. So what made the police really go after this bloke and pick him up? Well, interestingly, two doctors, Dr. Cowan and Dr. Holloway, went to the police and said, "We think you need to find the Mad Butcher." Now, these two doctors had been talking to George Tyler, who owned a bit of a lodging house, and he'd met Jacob Isenschmid on September the 5th and felt sorry for him and gave him a place to stay. But he said he was very strange in his behaviour and I was a bit sketchy on him, but I haven't seen him since the Annie Chapman crime. And when everyone was reading what was being said about the two crimes previous with Polly Nichols and Annie Chapman, they're thinking, could be this bloke. Added to that, Jacob Isenschmid himself went around calling himself Leather Apron. And remembering, after the Annie Chapman crime, the big splash in the newspaper, capture Leather Apron. But there was actually more to it than that as well. There was a Mrs. Fittymont who owned the Prince Albert pub. She said a person matching Isenschmid's description came into the pub on September the 8th at 7 a.m, remembering that is the morning of the Annie Chapman crime. Now, she said her initial feeling towards this bloke was she was a bit scared. He just had this real menacing look in his eye. Anyway, he orders his drink. And whilst Mrs. Fittymont is talking to someone at the bar herself, she looks over and notices this bloke's got a bit of a ripped shirt and blood spatters on him. Now, I'd say a conversation happens inside that Prince Albert pub for Mrs. Fittymont to talk to a builder, Joseph Taylor, to say, hey, we need to check out this bloke because he is sketchy. Now, already the news of what happened to Annie Chapman, no doubt, was around the area. And so Joseph Taylor follows him, and this is weird, because Joseph Taylor gives this description of Jacob Isenschmid with this fast walk. So he's booking it away from the pub. And a bit of a springy step as well. Taylor says it reminded him of a horse soldier with how upright he was. Now I'm guessing back in the day, if you're a soldier and you're on horseback, you'd be riding fairly stiff with your back straight. And he said that's how he looked, this bloke he was following. But the bloke also had a long neck. He said he had his coat, but was holding it tight at the top, holding it tight together at the top. And he also said the bloke he was following had a nervous and frightened disposition. And he said he just looked very, very strange. He also said he had a ginger-coloured mustache and was a bit shabby, but, probably what we'd call today smart casual. So he wasn't dressed to the nines. He looked a bit out of shape, but he wasn't exactly looking like a homeless person. Now, not all those details probably matched the description of Jacob Isenschmid, but many of them could fit. The one thing I question there is, how do you tell someone's got a long neck if they're holding their coat up around their neck like that? Like, I just don't see that myself. So, I again go to, you can't necessarily trust all eyewitness descriptions. So they put Sergeant Thick on the case. The bloke that actually arrested John Pfizer as Leather Apron, well, he also arrested this bloke. And apparently, Isenschmid did not go all that quietly, but they got him to the Holloway police station. Then they sent him off to the Islington, workhouse. But then they ends up at the Bow, or is it Bow? Let me know in comments, is it Bow or Bow? But anyway, he goes to that infirmary for the insane. Now, remembering this is very early in the Jack the Ripper saga, but Inspector Aberline made a comment after Isenschmid was arrested, and I quote, he says, although we're unable at present to procure any evidence to connect him with the murders, he appears to be the most likely person that has come under our notice to have committed the crimes. So he's now thinking, we've got our man. These crimes will stop. And perhaps they thought they did, because it took a little while, a few weeks, before the crimes recommenced. But interestingly, it's his wife that made some comments. Yes, Isenschmid was married, but they had a very rocky relationship. And you can't really blame her when you hear her comments. First, she said she hadn't seen him for about 2 months. He'd gone completely off her radar, as well as he was in the habit of carrying around knives. Now, I will say, as a butcher, that probably wasn't all that uncommon, but she may have had reason to want to throw this bloke under the bus a little bit, because she does make a very odd statement. She said, I don't think he'd hurt anyone but me, but if he had the opportunity, I think he'd do away with me. Just unbelievable. But she did make an insightful comment saying he hadn't been right in the head, her words apparently, if they've been put down correctly, since 1882 after he had a fit. Now again, we're seeing people with some type of brain condition that are now acting in a very, very peculiar way for back then, which also highlights the sad state of any mental health help that you might have been able to get back then. It was just basically non-existent. And we know that because of his earlier history as well. So even before 1888, he had been put into an asylum in 1887. And oddly, he was released from that late 1887, which does coincide when all of the Whitechapel murders began. But why was he locked up the first time? Well, it said because he had been working his own business, but that went financially downhill. So he then started a decline himself. He threatened to blow up the Queen, do away with his wife, his children, and apparently his neighbours as well. So everyone was going to be collateral damage to this. So they lock him up, but then after a little while, they deem him to be sane. They send him back out, and he says, well, I'm going to make it right with my wife. So they start living together again in 1888, but then that went downhill fast. And then, as she said, she hadn't seen him for 2 months before the actual official Jack the Ripper crimes began. Now, we have to make a statement here that it was very, very common for people to go into these psychiatric hospitals and then all of a sudden they're cured. They get sent back out, and before too long they go downhill and they're going in and out of these places for the rest of their lives until eventually they effectively get locked up and that's where they stay. But the pressure on the government services back then was absolutely huge. They did not have the social security infrastructure in place, and so workhouses were designed as prisons for the poor. So maybe these asylums are a better place to go, so perhaps people tried to pretend like they were crazy so that they could get better treatment. The amount of women having to work the streets just to get a roof over their heads. Conditions were dreadful. So whilst I don't think Jacob Isenschmid himself was a high-class human being, you can sort of have some sympathy for these people because life and times were very, very tough. But now here's the thing. After later crimes occurred, from Elizabeth Stride on, they say, well, this bloke could not have done them because he wasn't out on the street. So he's innocent of these other ones, of the crimes that have been done before. But what I'm going to look at in a later video, but I'll just raise it briefly here, that a few people had been arrested with reasonable suspicion that they could have committed these crimes. But then when the later ones have happened, they say, well, okay, you couldn't have done them, so they were released. Now, is it possible? Because this has happened with other serial crimes, that people have done copycat killings to hide their true intent. They go, if we mimic what was done before, and there's no possible way we could be connected to those crimes, we'll get away with this one. But that is food for thought for another video when I dive into that as a possibility as well. But we are going to stick to the Butcher's theme on the next video, and we're going to look at Butcher's Row in general, and that has some intriguing detail in it. But right now, was Jacob Isenschmid Jack the Ripper? What do you think? Does it pass the pub test for me? I don't see it. I would need more evidence. As I said, the ripped shirt and a bit of blood splatter. I would not surprised if many butchers in the area had that sort of look about them first thing of a morning, probably after they finished a shift. Was he odd? Did he have mental health issues? Absolutely. But I just don't see him as the perpetrator of these crimes. But the police back in the day definitely had him on the radar, because he's one of the very few who was actually arrested for the crimes. But as always, let me know what you think of this one. Give us a like, give us a subscribe. Actually, you don't really need to worry about doing that if you don't want to. I enjoy doing these videos, whether you like or subscribe or not. But thank you for all your words of encouragement down in comments. It is genuinely appreciated. And to you people who are sharing these videos wherever you're putting them out there, thank you very much. I'm Owen. You've been watching the Pub Test, and we will see you on the next one.